We've got an extra special episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast, for you today. We were invited deep into the bowels of Whitehall to the room where government ministers handle national crises and emergencies. Just one thing, because it's so top secret, we weren't allowed to film in there, so you will have to listen to it. But it's still super, super interesting and very top secret. Hello, Chris and I are today making podcasting, nay, broadcasting history, aren't we?
We are, yeah, because we are going to and are reporting from a spot where in 20 plus years of reporting on Westminster, I reckon barely a couple of months has gone by without me referring to where we are, but without ever having stepped through the door or multiple doors.
And where we are is the Cabinet Office briefing rooms in Whitehall, where ministers and officials gather when there's a crisis. And we always call it Cobra in the media, but we've been told by all the Cabinet officials, there's no such thing as Cobra, just call it the Cabinet Office briefing room. So that's where we are. So we're in, just explain the facility we're in.
So we are in right now, aren't we, what effectively feels like a boardroom. And I'm sitting at the head of a rectangular table with a semicircular end. And it turns out, I've discovered, I am sitting in the chair's seat.
Which is quite often the Prime Minister.
So the Prime Minister or a senior minister or whoever it might be. And then we've got what? We've got 3 flat screens down one side of the room and a couple down the other.
Massive video wall at the end.
A red microphone sign that looks like the sort of thing you'd see outside one of our... in fact, outside Newscast HQ, except it says SEC View on it.
Apparently that gets turned on when you're on a secure line. There's a bunch of cameras on the ceiling and the walls, so you can do your video conferencing with your foreign counterparts or your British officials abroad. There's a digital clock on the wall, and just as you'd expect, it's got multiple time zones. In the middle is COBR, Cobra, where we are right now, and we're currently recording this at 1:30 on Monday. And on the other side is the time in Washington, and on the other side is the time in New Delhi. Slightly what weirds me out is the huge, big, thick door.
Yeah, massive door. It was a good couple of inches thick. It's got lots of metal on it, and I suspect it's quite hard to get in or out unless you know what you're doing.
There are no windows, so I'm glad we've got that clock, because otherwise you'd have no idea what time it is in here. You do feel very kind of... sort of sequestered from the outside world, don't you?
You do a bit. And then there is the artwork, isn't there?
Yeah.
So it's a regular topic of conversation whenever I go in and see ministers in more conventional parts of Whitehall, that you end up just as a kind of icebreaker, particularly when a government's just taken office or a minister has just taken office, talking about the artwork, because there's a government art collection where loads of pictures are in some cellar somewhere, and ministers can request their own artwork. But here we are in the Cobra, one of the Cobra rooms, and there's art on the wall, isn't there? So there's looking at next to one of the big flat screens. This is where my poverty of floral description is going to be found wanting. There is a quartet of brightly coloured images of, what are they, tulips or roses?
Yeah, I mean, I just think if I was managing a crisis, I'd want to be sat opposite the tulip painting, just for like a little moment of mindfulness when you're dealing with the drama.
A little bit of colour.
More seriously, we should explain why we're here. We've been invited by Pat McFadden, who is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, so Minister for the Cabinet Office. He is responsible for emergency preparedness and resilience. And as part of that resilience, there's going to be another test later this year of the government's emergency alert system, where your mobile phone, every mobile phone in Britain that is working and it's on 4 or 5G, gets a message from the government and a really, really loud noise. And Pat McFadden is going to reveal to us the date of the next test, so you can get ready for that.
And then the overall sort of essence of that amounts to, I think, a government that is thinking, this is the digital era now, and how does it communicate in a time of crisis with all of us in a way that doesn't seem really weird if it happens for real for the first time and we're not really expecting it, coupled with how does government as a whole build a kind of network of connections so that it is more than the sum of its parts rather than less than the sum of its parts when suddenly something big happens just like that, and kind of rightly we as kind of citizens look towards government to look out for us.
And of course, the bigger context here is that the government and the civil service are having to react to the first part of the COVID inquiry, which said there was just this massive spaghetti soup of organisations that are meant to act up in a crisis, and it was just too complicated and it needed to be streamlined and people's responsibilities needed to be clearer. And also this government saying they want to spend more money on things like homeland security because the world's getting increasingly unstable. So in a minute, we'll introduce you to Pat McFadden. He can tell us all the stuff he wants to talk about. But just before we do that, have you got any sort of Cobra memories you want to?
Oh, I mean, so many Cobra
about?
memories. There's the ones that are I don't really associate with Cobra so much as the big crises that were going on at the time, and then there are those that are more niche, if you like. So I think I recall. I'm going to have to check this because as I utter this out loud, I may be proven wrong. I think there was a Cobra once about ash dieback disease. Now, that mattered in terms of the kind of stock of trees and all the rest of it. I don't mean to be disparaging about that in terms of, biodiversity and all the rest of it. But it wasn't one of the classics of the assembly of a Cobra meeting after an air crash or a terror attack, or the things that you might initially associate with a moment of national crisis. And then you get ones that happen at an official level that don't necessarily involve ministers around this table, and then those that involve ministers, and then those that involve the Prime Minister. I'd love to know, actually, there must be a stat somewhere about how many happen in a typical year, or how many there've been in the last
Okay, that's quite a niche
years.
stat even for
I know,
me.
but just in terms of how often
Yeah.
this infrastructure that we're sitting in the middle of gets cranked up
Yeah.
into big time action, I've stood outside in the street trying to grab people coming in.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was just reminiscing with myself about the first Cobra I ever covered, and it was the meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear reactor after the tsunami in Japan in 2011. And I remember being sent up to stand outside the front door of the Cabinet Office and film everyone going in, and then doing a kind of huddle with William Hague, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time. And he came out of the meeting to explain all the things they were doing to make sure that British citizens overseas were safe and what assistance they could provide the Japanese. And I remember at the time, it was all kicking off in Syria as well. And there was another international crisis happening at the same time. And I remember saying to William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, there's three massive things going on right now. Have you got, as a government and the Foreign Office, got the bandwidth to deal with all of these? And he said, oh, yes. And it was very reassuring. And then a few years afterwards, somebody from the Foreign Office said, yeah, only just.
Right.
So I just always remember that. And then I remember being outside when those, again, 2011, when all those riots were erupting in English cities. And do you remember Boris Johnson, Mayor of London, then arriving late for that meeting?
Yes,
Sound familiar?
He dashed back from a holiday in Canada, I think.
No, he was back, but he was just late for the actual meeting.
Oh, I see.
So you always get the real sense of like, this is where big decisions are being made when big things are happening to the country. And Pat McFadden also wants to talk to us about how the government's getting ready for the next pandemic, because they're going to be staging a big exercise for ministers and officials later this year. So let's see what juicy details we can get about that.
Yeah, you get a real sense, actually, of how this whole place has kind of recalibrated and rebooted itself since the last pandemic, aware of the scale of who knows what might be around the corner, but the failings exposed by that.
So coming to you from Cobra, although I know it's not technically called that, and I'm looking around at the Cabinet Office officials who will be annoyed with me, this is Newscast. Pat McFadden, hello.
Hello and welcome to Cobra.
Well, are we meant to call it Cobra?
You can call it Cobra.
Well, because we've just been speaking to some of your officials, and they say actually they prefer it that we called it the Cabinet Office briefing rooms, because it's a series of rooms rather than just one.
It is. It's a suite of rooms, of which one is this.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So we'll talk about the purpose of Cobra in a minute. But the thing you're talking to us about today is the emergency alert system, and there's going to be another trial run of it. When?
It's going to be on the 7th of September at 3 p.m. This is a really important national test. It's the countrywide equivalent of somebody testing their fire alarm or their smoke alarm. It's been developed in recent years. It's a really valuable system of communication between the government and public in emergency situations. What we're doing in September is the second national test, but the system has been used a few times in real life, mainly in extreme storm situations, a couple of times over the winter, on a more limited basis than the national basis. We had to use it over Storm Éowyn in Northern Ireland and Scotland, and Storm Dara in Wales and the southwest during the winter. So this is the second national test.
And is the purpose of it to get all of us lot used to the idea of getting something from government at a time of emergency, or is it to work out if it works?
Well, it's both. It's you've got to test things to see if they work, and you always learn something from each test. But this is normal in many countries. This idea of some exercise in emergency preparedness, some notion that as part of our citizenship, this kind of thing will happen. And the emergency alert is one part of it, but there are other parts too. And when we talk about resilience as a country, it isn't just something for the government. It's about deep strength in society and also some basic tools of emergency preparedness.
You must be having to think though. You're always not wanting to freak people out or scare people. You want people to be resilient, but you don't want people to be nervous or worried. Or maybe you do want people to be a bit worried. Maybe we need to be a little bit more worried than we have been.
Want people to be aware of. I just think we should see this as normal. And when this test comes along, this is the second time in 2 years. As we go forward into the future, these kind of tests periodically, every so often, will be part of life.
Right.
This is a new tool which is a product of the mobile phone age. We now have 87 million mobile phones in the UK, and that's not a mechanism that was available to government in the past to communicate directly to everybody at the push of a button.
And how does that then work technologically? So a message will go out to all 87 million, will they, irrespective of whether the phone is on silent or not? I guess it's got to be turned on.
And you get a really loud noise as well. I remember last time it happened, I was actually on the train and everyone's phones just started screeching at the same time. I say at the same time, there was a bit of a gap of a couple of minutes depending on your mobile phone provider, but like you can't miss it.
Yeah, it's loud and intentionally so. It goes out to all mobile phones, yeah. Anybody on 4G or 5G will get it. There are some precautions we take with vulnerable groups. For example, there might be some people who have a second mobile phone for reasons of personal protection. We don't encourage people to opt out of it, but there is a way on a government UK.alert website where people can find out how to do that. It's not something we'd encourage, but we understand that provision should be there for people who really need to opt out because they don't want that phone to be discovered. Victims of domestic violence, for example, who might have a phone for that reason.
You mentioned the 4G and the 5G thing. I guess there's pockets, aren't there, where said signals don't reach. How do you get to those people in that situation?
Obviously, if you're out of signal, you won't get this.
Right.
What crisis?
What will happen is the next time you are in signal, it'll probably still go off.
Right.
What is the deal behind the scenes for if you're having to issue one of these alerts to the whole country in the midst of a crisis? I mean, is there a sort of protocol in place for like when the button gets pressed? And
Yes.
are there pre-written messages for various different kind of crises?
Yes. So, for example, during the storms, we had 2 red weather alert storms, which means danger to life. It's quite unusual to get 2 so close together. Sometimes you might have years where you wouldn't have one. We had 2 within a few weeks of one another. And the system at that time is the Cobra team who work this, who govern this. They will come to me. They will say that it's a red weather warning. Here are the areas of the country where this will really apply.
Should you say, I think the aircon's just gone off. That's not a sign of an impending crisis. Sorry.
They'll ask for my permission to do it. We have a look at the text. Apart from danger to life, there is usually some call to action to do something or not do something. And you have to pick the time as well, because it's obviously better times of the day to do this.
Oh, like, in what sense?
Well, for example, you might not want to do it in the middle of the night when people are sleeping. If it would be better to do it earlier in the evening before they put their kids to bed. You won't always have that option, but you take the time into account as well.
Right. Other things about resilience. I know you're promoting the preparedness bit of gov.uk. I had a look on that on the way here. You ask people to do quite a lot. It's like wind-up radio, torch, a phone battery pack.
How many
maybe
of them have
10
you got?
litres of... not enough. I certainly don't have 10 litres of bottled water. It's like it's quite. You have to have quite a lot of stuff to be like fully ready, don't you?
Well, this is advice, and I think it's sensible advice. And some people might say, I don't want to do that, or for some other reason not do it. But this is advice that's there as to what people should readily have in hand if they can. And it's the items you mentioned, batteries, a radio, some torches, some bottled water, that kind of thing to have at home. It's all there on the gov.prepare website.
I'm glad a wind-up radio features.
Well, I know you've got one.
I have, yeah, I have.
One in each room, probably.
Or
I've got
or a
one.
battery radio if you've got enough batteries.
Yeah,
but have some batteries as well, because it's not much good to you if you.
And let's broaden out from the alert exercise planned in September and that wider national resilience to where we are, because we are in one of the Cabinet Office briefing rooms for Cobra. I was saying, as we were shown down here by your staff, I've reported on so many Cobra meetings over the years, and you have in your mind's eye a sense of the infrastructure that lies behind the various government doors that people might walk around in Whitehall. And here we are in this Cobra room. In fact, I'm sitting right at the head of the table.
You're in the chair.
I'm in the chair.
You're in the chair, yeah.
That is a responsibility no one wants me to have. Give us a sense of this room and what can happen in this room and what is particular about this room that allows the various arms of government to come together at a moment where there is a Cobra meeting.
Well, Cobra is like a cabinet committee, but it's got some unusual features. It can include people from outside government. So if you have a Cobra meeting in this room, it might, depending on the situation, have members of the armed forces or representatives of the police and first responders. It just depends on the situation. You'll see from the clocks over there that one of the clocks is set at New Delhi time. That's because there was a recent meeting in here about the Air India plane crash, where we would have been joined by the High Commissioner, by others who were engaged in the response to that. And Cobra should not be thought of just as a room where people meet. There's a whole team behind it. And it's a team, I think, that have got particular characteristics. The team is led by an excellent civil servant, Roger Hargreaves, and they have a very can-do, action-orientated mindset. To give you another example, when we were hit by Storm Eowyn during the winter, the Cobra team were fantastic at ensuring the provision of equipment, the speedy passage of people for engineering work to try to reconnect people to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was where the storm had its worst effect. And I thought they really came into their own over those few days. And we were able, from this room to offer very practical help to the Northern Ireland executive and to people in Northern Ireland, some of whom were cut off from power for a number of days, which is very, very difficult. So it's a room, it's a recognised symbol, as you say, of the government meeting, but it's also a team of people who really get on with the job without some of the processes you might find elsewhere in Whitehall.
And not to make this sound like a sort of GCSE English assignment, but conjure the mood for us about when everyone comes in here and something really bad has happened and lots of stuff has to be done.
It is very outcome action focused. There's not a sort of huge Socratic debate about what's happened. People usually know what's happened. So what we will want to know is, right, what is the Department of Transport doing? What is the situation of readiness with the armed forces? What are the police doing? Depends on the situation, but that's the kind of question that is asked. And whoever's in the chair, often it's the Prime Minister, but Cobra can be chaired by other ministers too. For example, the Foreign Secretary might convene a Cobra about a particular foreign policy crisis, particularly affecting, say, UK citizens abroad. and the meeting will be very much focused on action rather than too many words.
Because I guess it's government at its absolute core, isn't it? Resilience, protecting people, keeping people safe. Shorn of the inevitable sort of party politics of plenty of other discussions, it's dealing with the here and now in a emergency situation.
Yeah, there's not much party politics when Cobra meets. Everybody's focused on the job. If I could give another example, very early in the life of the government, we had the terrible killings at Southport, and the Prime Minister convened several Cobra meetings to try to coordinate the response to what was happening on the streets. And that was a very difficult time for the country. And he very much took control, convened all the right people in the room, and drove it on a daily basis.
Give us some sense then of how the whole business, the infrastructure of resilience within government, with Cobra at the centre of it, has changed since the pandemic. Because obviously the pandemic was a sort of, for our generation, a uniquely big moment that will have stretched government as it did society to levels that you couldn't really have anticipated. And since then, there's been quite the change, hasn't there?
I think it's a really good question. And there's a few things I would point to. I think the system is probably faster now, where having gone through that, people learned from it. What you've got to watch is that you don't forget the lessons as time goes on and staff change from the jobs they were doing and so on. I mean, COVID's 5 years ago now. So speed is important. I think the way that we think about vulnerability has also changed. COVID exposed a lot of cracks in society about who was affected most severely. And so upstairs, for example, in the Situation Centre, we have this vulnerability map now that when there is an emergency situation, we will have a better idea of who really needs help, who's totally dependent, who maybe is less able to do things on their own. I think the training of first responders has changed. We opened a UK Resilience Academy up in Yorkshire a few months ago, and that trains thousands of first responders every year. And some of the investments into capacity to test pathogens and develop vaccines and so on. So there's a number of things that's changed. But if you ask me, what does resilience really come down to? It's quite a difficult concept for people to grasp. I would say two things. One is the deep strength of your society. What do I mean by that? Things like an NHS that can cope, even a good transport system to allow people to get around. Those deep sort of strengths of the country. And the second I liken to insurance. Nobody wants to have no insurance. You've got to have some insurance. What is the right level? And by insurance, I mean these emergency response things that can be scaled up. They're not going to be always on all the time, but when the crisis comes, can you scale up quite quickly and get yourself ready?
But bearing all that in mind, do people just have to accept, though, that if something really bad happens, and I won't conjure up a nightmare scenario, but something really bad happens, there will be points where where it feels like chaos, or it feels like the country's in quite a bad way, and actually people will have to do stuff themselves. Like, you can put in all your plans and make us as resilient as possible, but do people just have to kind of get real about what bad things are actually like?
Well, what's that military metaphor about no plan survives first contact with the enemy? We plan as best we can. Look, we are very fortunate in this country. I think our first responders and emergency services are absolutely world class. We have great expertise. But yes, part of this is when we talk about what supplies or equipment you need at home, what you should do in an emergency. Part of this is about a communication to the public. There are just some certain basic, sensible things that we should all do. And I want this to be normal, this discussion. I don't want it to be, oh, my goodness, you're going to alarm people or anything like that. I want this to be a normal thing where people say, yeah, that's right. That's just part of the way we live, is to think about that.
Basically, more podcasts, less disaster movie.
At the level of it, yes, definitely podcast. Definitely podcast. Yeah.
Right answer. I'm intrigued by something you said a second ago, which I'd love to sort of hear an example of. You were talking about vulnerability mapping.
Yeah.
Can you give me a sense? What does that kind of look like? How do you harness the kind of vast data of government that swirls around this postcode in a scenario that suddenly presents itself, and you've got to work out who's most in need of help?
Well, for example, energy companies will have a register of their most vulnerable customers.
Right.
They're the people who you might want to reconnect first, or the people who you know if they're disconnected, they're perhaps elderly, frail, dependent on certain medical supplies, all of this kind of thing, to try to map out in a particular situation, because resilience has to be for everybody. It can't just be for some.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when I went on the preparedness website, the first bit of advice is, if you're a vulnerable person, sign up with your electricity company so they know you're a vulnerable person. And I suppose that's quite a good example of what you've just been talking about, of rather than stockpiling iodine tablets for a nuclear apocalypse, which is kind of the old school way of thinking about it, or prepare to make a shelter out of your kitchen table. It's like, actually, here's a very practical, easy thing you can do online right now that could have quite a big impact.
Yeah, practical, easy things to do. And look, when you look back at COVID, we know there were certain ethnic minority groups this hit harder, people in certain occupations, they were hit harder. I think we should be honest and open about that and talk about it. These things don't affect everybody the same. And when we're not honest and open about it, it's just going to make society angry. So we are trying to use the information that good data provides to try to map that and understand it more deeply.
How much is there a fear, perhaps a sort of a human nature fear, really, that the collective infrastructure might be very good at learning the lessons of the last crisis, but unsidestep the one that's around the corner?
It's a really good question. I am so conscious of that there is a risk in all of this that you prepare perfectly for the last war.
Yeah.
Another respiratory virus, say.
So let me give you an example. We're going to, as well as the emergency test alert, we are going to have a national pandemic planning exercise later this year. And we have to think about what kind of situation will we be talking about.
Which might be very different from...
It might be different. Now, we can't say for sure we're going to predict the future, but we should factor into our thinking about that it might not be exactly the same as the recent experience with COVID a few years ago.
Have you come up with an imaginary virus yet for that? What's it going to be like?
I can't tell you what it will be yet, but the question that Chris asked is part of the thinking about the exercise is let's not make it exactly the same as the past. Let's scan the horizon, think about something that's likely or at least possible. Now, we don't know, as I say, if that will be the emergency that comes, but the warning not to prepare with perfect hindsight is a very good one.
And just in terms of that exercise, is it called Operation Pegasus?
Pegasus, yes.
Yeah. And how candid will you be about how well or badly it goes afterwards? Like, will you tell us if it was a total disaster? Because remember, what was it, Operation Cygnus under the previous government, which was a pandemic plan, and there was lots of speculation about how that had gone because we just didn't know the results.
I think we should be candid, and it will show things that have gone wrong because that's partly why you're doing it. And we should learn from those and communicate them in the right way. I can guarantee you one thing about this exercise Pegasus: it won't show that everything's perfect. And
I suppose you kind of want it to go as wrong as possible, so you can learn
about as wrong as possible, but you want it to show where you're falling down or where there's things you didn't think of that you haven't thought through. That's the whole point of doing it.
Because I guess another part of all of this is risk, isn't it? And how risk is measured and the extent to which data sets and analysis can reasonably point to what is a high-risk event versus a lower-risk event, and then the preparation that's put into those range of possibilities.
So we publish this national risk register if you want something to keep you awake at night.
I also read that this morning, so that's quite terrifying.
And it is part of our job to think about those things. They're probably very unlikely, but I think the government should be aware of them. And that's why I use this metaphor about insurance a little bit, because we all need insurance, whether it's for your car, your home, or whatever, but you wouldn't spend your whole income on insurance.
No.
And so there is always if we're being candid about it, a balance to be struck between what you spend on the day-to-day provision of providing the health service every week, for running the welfare system, all the things that government has to do, and this extra thing where you're trying to plan for the unknown. And the thing about emergencies is it's really easy to say you should have planned for that better and you should have done everything that was needed to do. But the reason I think insurance is quite a good parallel in that you want the right amount of insurance, but you also have to live your life month to month as well, and that's the decision that government has to take.
From memory, reading the risk register, because you split there's a sort of matrix there, isn't it, where on one end you've got the likelihood of the thing happening, whether it's very unlikely or quite likely, and then on the other axis is how catastrophic it could be.
You don't want to be in the corner where both meet.
Well, there's not that many things that are very likely and very catastrophic. So I think the most catastrophic thing is a nuclear power plant exploding in Europe, isn't it, and then poisoning us all. But that's very unlikely. Don't have nightmares. Can I just say, the hilarious thing is, like, this massive video wall at the other end of the table, it sort of went dark and then it's just lit up again, but with the Microsoft Windows screensaver we all have on all our computers, which is quite a weird juxtaposition.
And it was flagging up that it was National Radio Day, which I thought was a key moment of national resilience.
I just wondered if Donald Trump was going to video conference it.
You never know who will appear on that screen.
We're probably running out of time now. I'm looking over at your colleagues and they're looking at their watches. But just psychologically in this room, even though I've only been in here half an hour, I feel quite removed from the outside world here. Okay, no one's like Donald Trump isn't video conferencing in. We're just sat here having a chat. But there's no windows. We're maybe underground. I'm not really sure where we are. Do you ever feel sometimes when you're in here, it just doesn't feel real? Because it does. It feels very unreal in here.
But not really. I think it feels like you're focused on whatever it is. Remember, we're speaking here in a very different atmosphere from normal because we're doing this podcast and there's no emergency. Every other time when you walk in here, everybody knows what the subject matter is. And that's why they get on with it. Look, what would I say about this? It's a room that focuses minds, and it's an operation that's really focused on outcomes. As you said, Chris, this isn't a partisan place. Nobody would waste time in here making a speech about some other politician or party. It's very much focused on the job, but it's really important not to think of it just as a room. This is where coordination happens that's backed by a really top-class team of officials outside the room, and also where you can pull things in from different departments. So it might be Department of Transport has certain equipment, it might be the MOD has certain equipment, it might be the Department of Health has certain equipment. They can be pulled into a central resource here in response to an emergency to make sure that government is doing what it should be doing, which is trying to help people when the chips are down.
Is there a sharing then? Because as you say, it's detached from the normal sort of yaboo of party politics, where predecessors in your role of a different political hue would be more willing to share their experience of a previous crisis when they were sitting in the chair that you're sitting in, or other ministers. I
think that's true. I think, outside the normal kind of verbal punch-up that we have in politics, usually across the parties, I would have no hesitation in asking a predecessor their advice or how they would have handled a particular situation. And the truth is, most people who've done a job in government quite like being asked that as well. Right. In truth. So that kind of
because ultimately, who doesn't want people in this room in the middle of a crisis to succeed?
Exactly. And for all my profession gets knocked, the people who do it want to serve the public, so why wouldn't they give a bit of advice or benefit of experience to somebody who's doing it today?
And just a very nerdy question from me. Also, my research, I was looking at this piece of legislation called the Civil Contingencies Act. And I remember during COVID, there was a bit of a kind of niche argument about whether that should have been invoked to give the government the powers it needed. I mean, you read that legislation and it is it's quite scary because it's basically the potential to suspend all the freedoms in society. You could ban people traveling anywhere. The government can seize whatever property it wants. I just wonder how it would feel as a minister having to like press the button on that piece of legislation.
Well, precisely because the powers in it are so strong, the bar to enacting it is very, very high. And I've not come across a situation where that bar has been reached. And so that's a very break glass and emergency piece of legislation. It's not to be used lightly. And certainly in the year that I've been in here and the various emergencies that we've dealt with, we haven't come close to using that. We haven't needed to.
I'm conscious we don't want to be the very first people, and maybe not the very first people, to be kicked out of Cobra for overstaying our welcome. So we should wrap things up. I must ask you, though, after the sort of week that the government has had, I know it seems, as you rightly say, in this room, very detached from party politics, rightly, but you're one of the most senior figures in the government and acutely aware of how challenging the last week has been. Are you guys going to get the show back on the road? It's been a bumpy 7 days.
It has been a bumpy 7 days. What are my reflections on it? Any decision like that has financial consequences. I believe those consequences have to be owned by all of us. That's really important.
Tax rises.
I'm not.
When you say all of us, do you mean everyone in society or everyone in the government?
In the government and in the Parliamentary Labour Party. These things do have consequences. There's lots of moving parts to a budget. We'll have to figure all that out. But there are financial consequences to that. The other really important thing is we are here to change the country. We're not here to keep everything as it is and as we inherited it. And so it's really important that the lesson we don't learn from the experience of the last couple of weeks is that change is too difficult. Change has to happen. And we are seizing the nettle on change, from the planning system to the big changes in the NHS to the changes in our energy system. People voted for change, and it's really important, even though it has been a bumpy week, that we get on with change.
Sounds like you're saying to Labour MPs, you've got to be brave, you've got to make the most of this time in government, and that might mean sort of, picking some fights and getting on with it.
As I say, people did vote for change, and I don't want anyone to conclude from the difficult time that we had over welfare reform that somehow big reforms shouldn't be done, because the country does need reform, and that's what we're here for.
Well, thanks very much for letting us be in here. Thank you.
Thank you.